Good morning, everybody. I think we'll get started with the webinar this morning. It's great to see so many of our energy partners and industry colleagues and other aggregators joining us for the webinar. In terms of introductions, who we have at this end, we've got Dr. Alastair Martin, Flexitricity's founder and Chief Strategy Officer, as well as Saskia Barker, our Service Development Engineer. She and Alastair have been leading the charge internally in terms of decoding the legislation and putting it into the presentable format that we will be covering today. Also on the line, we have myself, Andrew Langlands, and my colleague Lisa Perrin, Flexitricity's account management team. No doubt many of you have spoken or met with us in the past, and we will be following up with energy partners individually in the weeks after this webinar to discuss individual sites and future participation in demand-side response services. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar. We'll be coming to them at the end after Alastair's finished speaking. You'll see a panel on the right-hand side. Click on the chat function, and then in the drop-down menu, if you select Send to All Panelists, that means one of us should be able to pick up the questions. I'll repeat again, please feel free to send the questions throughout the webinar, and we'll be coming to them at the end. One final piece of information, we are recording the webinar. Everyone is muted apart from us, and we'll make sure that the link and slides are available to everyone in the forthcoming days. So thanks very much for attending, and I'll hand over to Alastair to get started.
Hello, thanks Andrew for that. My name is Alastair. So we're talking about the Medium Combustion Plant Directive, or are we? So the MCPD, Medium Combustion Plant Directive, just to explain, is actually not the law. The MCPD is a directive that came from the European Parliament and the European Council, and it places obligations on member states of the European Union. The law is comprised in the two pieces of legislation that came out as a result of this directive, one covering England and Wales, the statutory instrument which was passed last month, called the Environmental Permitting England-Wales Amendment Regulations 2018, and the other covering Scotland is the Pollution Prevention and Control Scotland Amendment Regulations 2017. You see the front pages of those there, and they differ in many ways. The Scottish version follows fairly closely what the MCPD itself actually requires, whereas the England and Wales version covers the MCPD requirements and then goes a lot further in certain areas. Okay, so in going through this, I'm going to be drawing distinctions between definitions in order to make sure that everybody understands the particular things we're talking about. So there's a little bit of A/B testing, if you like, here. Are you one thing or are you the other thing, or are you both? Well, the first thing we have to determine is whether we're talking about a medium combustion plant, an MCP, or a generator. So a generator in this context is a defined term in the England and Wales legislation. A generator is basically anything that burns fuel in order to create electricity. So any size, up to 50 megawatts thermal input, I should say, because if it's got more than 50 megawatts thermal input, then it's covered by other legislation. So that includes standby diesel generators, backup diesels. It includes diesel rotary uninterruptible power supplies. It includes merchant peakers, whether gas or diesel, and so forth. A medium combustion plant is a definition that exists throughout GB, so England, Wales and Scotland, and it corresponds to any generator or boiler with more than 1 megawatt thermal input, again up to 50 megawatts of thermal input, if it's running for more than 500 hours per year. So an NCP basically is something that's going to be used more regularly, but of course you can be both. So a CHP, what's a CHP? Well, a CHP is probably a generator and an MCP. It's a generator because it turns fuel into electricity, and it's an MCP because it's running over 500 hours. And in most cases, it's likely to have more than 1 megawatt of thermal input, which would correspond to about 350, 400 kilowatts of electrical output, which means that both sets of rules apply if it's in England and Wales. If it's in Scotland, it's just an MCP, a medium combustion plant. So looking at MCPs, medium combustion plants, what do they have to comply with? Well, this is the same across the whole of GB. What we've done is taken a small subset of the myriad tables that exist in the legislation defining the emissions limit values that must be complied with. Just pulled out engines burning gas oil, that is to say diesel, or natural gas, or turbines burning natural gas. There are different emissions limits for things that burn solid fuels or other liquid fuels. And the big number to remember is this 190 milligrams per normal meter cubed. That is the number that keeps coming up, and I've got to put some context on that. This is MCPs, as I said, so it applies to combined heat and power generators and diesels if they run over 500 hours. Generally speaking, CHPs do and diesels don't. The emissions limit values for boilers are different, but they're all there in the legislation. Now, to understand that 190 milligrams per normal meter cubed, it's very important to look into the detail of what that means. A normal meter cubed is a cubic meter of engine exhaust gas that has cooled to 0 degrees C and reached atmospheric pressure and been mixed down with air so that it has an oxygen concentration of 15%. So this is a way of standardizing the measurement so that we're all measuring the same thing. But it does mean that when you read the numbers, you need to make sure that you're comparing like with like. Generally speaking, the word normal doesn't change, but the percentage of oxygen does. So if you're seeing a 5% O2 specification, it's 512 milligrams per normal meter cubed. Again, it's different. For boilers, a different form is used. It's also important to say that there are variations on this depending on the age of the medium combustion plant. There's one there immediately on the table. An engine burning natural gas has to comply with tighter limits if it's new. As I said, there is a distinction between generators and MCPs. A generator is a slightly different definition, and the permitting conditions are different again. So the emissions limits are shown there. Again, it's 190 at 15%. Other things that come out are you mustn't be able to see the smoke, not for anything at the time. So that's persistent visible emissions. And if secondary abatement, that is to say, if DNOx kit is needed to meet those limits, then it's got to start reasonably quickly. So within 20 minutes for old generators or 10 minutes for new generators, and they must be monitored every 3 years. So if it's an MCP, that is to say, if it's running over 500 hours, the MCP limits still apply. And furthermore, the requirements of that apply to generators, that's the minimum that must be complied with. In an area where there are significant levels of background pollution, you might find yourself having to comply with tighter limits. So who decides that? Well, it depends where you are. The Environment Agency covers England, Natural Environment Wales covers Wales. The local authorities set the local air quality standards, but as I said before, the definition of generator does not appear in the Scottish legislation, so only the MCP limits apply here. Having said that, air quality standards are applicable everywhere, and in Scotland it's the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, or SEPA, that sets those. So cleaning up. If you have a diesel engine, there is no way that you're going to comply with these limits unless you have secondary NOx abatement. Selective catalytic reduction is the method. It's a catalyst and urea injection. It's basically the same as a modern diesel. Gas engines, generally speaking, tend to achieve these emissions limit values already. Older engines, it is absolutely worth checking. There's one other caveat that needs to be put in place here, which is that while it is possible to set a gas engine to achieve these emissions limits, the result of doing so can be to make the engine less efficient, and it can also cause further an increase in methane slip. Methane slip is the phenomenon of incoming fuel which is not fully burnt in the engine, and that has a cost and it has an environmental implication. So in fact, potentially the best practice for a gas engine is actually to set the engine to high efficiency, which means that the completeness of the combustion is greater, the efficiency is higher, but the NOx level in the immediate exhaust of the engine is higher, and then fit selective catalytic reduction, so that the NOx is then brought back down. Another definition. We talked about generators. Well, generators are further subdivided into specified generators and excluded generators. So I'm going to read directly the words that define what an excluded generator is. These are two different sections of the England and Wales statutory instrument. Excluded generator includes backup generators operated for the purposes of testing for no more than 50 hours per year. So the purpose of testing has been debated by many, but what people mustn't do is forget the importance of the phrase backup generator, because that is a defined term itself, and it's a generator operated for the sole purpose of maintaining the power supply at a site during an emergency. Now, sole purpose, there is an explicit exclusion of capacity market or balancing services running in respect of backup generators, and there is, according to the guidance that we've received from DEFRA, an exclusion of running for triad avoidance, unless it's small, that is to say less than 1 megawatt of thermal input. Now, this is according to guidance. It is not according to the statutory instrument. So the words that you see there are the words that are there. And it is the statutory instrument that states the law. Obviously, DEFRA's guidance will have a significant influence on how the Environment Agency and Natural Environment Wales interpret the legislation. And while we are not giving legal advice on this webinar, I should make that absolutely clear, this is our interpretation. What we think is necessary for everybody to make absolutely clear and straightforward decisions is absolute statements of how these areas will be interpreted by the EA and Natural Environment Wales. We don't have those yet, so we're awaiting guidance on these matters. And while we don't have it, there are still some areas of doubt in the way this legislation will be applied. Now, this is all about excluded generators. The excluded generators, so testing for no more than 50 hours per year, well, that doesn't include running for a real emergency. So if somebody cuts the cable to your site and you end up running your generator for several days, then that does not use up your 50 hours. An excluded generator doesn't need a permit and therefore doesn't need to comply with one. So there are no emissions limits in this legislation applying to excluded generators. If you're not excluded, if your generator is not excluded, then it is specified. Specified generators are further subdivided into tranche A or tranche B. We'll come back to that. Any specified generator will eventually need a permit, and it will need to comply with that permit. But a specified generator can run for triad avoidance, and it can run to deliver capacity market agreements, and it can run for balancing services. And if it runs for less than 500 years, it is not an MCP. If it runs for more than 500 hours a year, then it is an MCP. So, can a specified generator become excluded? This is an area where we're seeking guidance from DEFRA. The question there is whether or not a generator that was previously a specified generator, perhaps doing triad management, perhaps running for a capacity market obligation, and perhaps delivering balancing services, to stops doing that and exits all of those, and then slips back into a role where it's run for 50 hours per year for testing only, then does then become an excluded generator. The legislation does not exclude that point. It doesn't say that you can't do that. We're rather keen to see an explicit statement on that, and we're encouraging the authorities to come out with an answer to that point. Okay, specified generators, tranche A or tranche B, and this is quite an important distinction. So this is the final subdivision that we're going to here. I'll do tranche B first. Tranche B, if you started operating after the 1st of December 2016, so a year and a bit old, or if you're operating under a capacity market or balancing services agreement that was achieved after last Halloween, either of those, then you're a tranche B generator, and you must have a permit and you must comply with it by the 1st of January next year. So that's just over 10 months to get a permit and comply with it. And that would apply to anybody who had a generator that had a participation in the auctions for the capacity market that ran at the end of January, beginning of February this year, or that took a short-term operating reserve contract in the January round, or that's recently become subject to a firm frequency response agreement through one of the tenders. They will have to have a permit and comply with it by the 1st of January 2019. A tranche B generator that does that can basically do all the things that it wants to do. It can manage triads, it can deliver balancing services, and it can deliver capacity market obligations. That's if you're tranche B. If you're tranche A, well, when are you tranche A? If you're a specified generator and you're not tranche B, then you're tranche A. The compliance states, the permitting and compliance states vary depending on size, and I'll come back to that. A tranche A generator can run for triad avoidance, but it can only run for existing capacity market and balancing services contracts. That is to say, ones that were signed before Halloween. If a generator becomes subject to an agreement after that date, then it immediately goes to tranche B, it becomes a tranche B. So, drilling into the dates for the tranche A generators. The latest at which a tranche A generator can participate in short-term operating reserve depends on the size. Little ones, less than 1 megawatt thermal input, that's about 350 odd kilowatts electrical output, can carry on to the end of March 2019. Slightly bigger ones, which is pretty much would be the vast majority of them, must stop participating in store by the end of this calendar year. And in fact, they need to not be under a contract that extends beyond this calendar year. They need to have to have no obligations beyond this calendar year. Can they participate in the capacity market? Yes, to the end of the delivery year, which ends in September 2021. So, and the reason for that is that that is the end date of Flexitricity's pre-2018 capacity market contracts. How many hours may it run if it's a tranche A generator? Well, if it's less than 5 megawatts thermal input, then it can run 500 hours. So 5 megawatts thermal input roughly corresponds to 2 megawatts electrical output. On the other hand, if it's bigger than that, then it must do fewer than 50 hours a year if its emissions are greater than 500 milligrams per normal meter cubed. An unabated standby diesel generator has higher emissions than that, unless you're a magician, you're going to be breaching that limit. And in terms of compliance, anything smaller than 5 megawatt thermal input has until January 2030 to be permitted and compliant with the permit, and the larger ones January 2025. Okay. Those were generators. We're back to MCPs, which contain some generators. The permit dates are slightly different. If an MCP is larger than 5 megawatts thermal input, it must be compliant with its permit by January 2025, but it's got to be registered a year before that and have its emissions tested within 4 months of that. The sort of 2 megawatt electrical down, the 5 megawatt thermal input down, then they have another 5 years to do that. But again, registering and testing emissions happens prior to 1 year prior to the date by which it has to be compliant. And if it's less than 1 megawatt thermal input, or if it's running less than 500 hours per annum, well, it's not an MCP. So it doesn't have to comply with any of this legislation unless it's also a specified generator. Okay. So this is almost a restatement of what we had before, but just pulling it all together and answering perhaps some of the little questions that might be outstanding. If something is both an MCP and a specified generator, then they don't have to apply for 2 permits, they only have to apply for 1. But of course the MCP deadlines will apply there, which means you've got to get started a little bit sooner. As I said earlier, an Environment Agency is in charge of the implementation of this in England. Natural Environment Wales does it in Wales. The Scottish Environment Protection Agency does it in Scotland. The process for obtaining permits has not been finalised. We're waiting for further information on how DEFRA will deal with this. But within this, we haven't really gone into exactly what constitutes 1 generator or 1 medium combustion plant. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that. Because the thermal limits, 5 megawatts thermal, 1 megawatt thermal, are clearly, how you interpret those depends very much on the site. So when we look at a medium combustion plant, it's important to know what constitutes 1 medium combustion plant. If you have a CHP and a boiler on the site, are those 1 MCP together, in which case a higher thermal limit would potentially apply, or are they individual assets, in which case they might be under the legislation applying to smaller limits? And the answer is, if they were in before December this year, then they're counted individually, and if it's after December this year, then they're counted together if they share a stack. If the flues go up the same chimney, then they're counted together. That's the definition that some people will be familiar with from the Large Combustion Plant Directive, which is now 10 years old. For specified generators, it's a little bit different. So the wording that we've got there comes out of the statutory instrument for England and Wales, which is obviously the only part that has that definition. Operated on the same site, by the same operator, and for the same purpose. So we're sort of seeking guidance on these, in particular concentrating on the phrase "for the same purpose." So what does that mean? The short answer is there's not been much explained as yet, but you're looking into it in some detail. This is our interpretation. Again, this is not legal advice. None of this is. A CHP and a diesel generator are on the same site, supplying electricity to the same load, but they're there for a different purpose. The CHP is there to serve heat customers, and the diesel is there to serve emergencies. So that would be our interpretation. On the other hand, a group of standby generators that are all controlled together, that all synchronize with the same bus, and they're all organized so that they work together as a team in order to cover the load of the site, we would interpret that as being the same purpose. Where you have a complex site with perhaps a ring main feeding around the site and individual standby generators located at particular loads, we would like to say that we think that's going to be different purposes, each generator in each different part of the site serving a different purpose. That would be easier to justify if those different parts of the site were indeed doing different activities, but we don't have clarification on that. So, just to finish off, I'll just summarize some of the questions that remain open that we're looking for guidance for from DEFRA and the agencies concerned. Very important points here that I haven't mentioned yet is the question of whether or not the specified excluded distinction prevents somebody from testing an excluded generator when the electricity is useful. As we know, the value of electricity changes from time to time. So if you were to test your generator at 1 AM on a Sunday morning, then your generator is obviously worth an awful lot less than if you tested it at 5:30 tonight. There's clearly a question there as to whether or not DEFRA has fully thought through what the implication is of the phrasing of the statutory instrument, and whether or not the guidance on triads is actually particularly helpful. The reducto ad absurdum answer is that if electricity value cannot be part of the story, then this could be the return of the load bank, which is obviously deliberate wasting of energy in order to load up a generator. We are very much not in favour of that. We think it's daft, and we hope that that is not going to be the interpretation that is applied, but we don't know that yet, so we're seeking clarification on that. The others, actually, most of them are mentioned on the way. Can a specified generator become an excluded generator? I mentioned that. So if a generator is no longer participating in any of the programs that are balancing services capacity market, does it stop being a specified generator and become an excluded generator? This is important. We're looking for guidance there. And the last one I just mentioned in the previous slide, if a site is complex, how do we interpret the words "for the same purpose" in order to know whether a generator fits under this or that a thermal limit bracket? And then the final one, which a lot of people are asking, is can the Environment Agency, which is the agency likely to be hit hardest with queries, can they handle all of these new permit applications? There's potentially going to be quite a lot. And that's where I'll stop. I'll hand back now to Andrew to marshal any questions that may have come in.
Thanks very much, Alastair, and thank you for the questions that are being submitted through the panel on the right-hand side. We have had a number that are submitted, so we'll try and get through them in order. We have a question around triads, and just looking for clarification on dates in which different size generators can continue with triad management. So I'll hand over to Saskia for this.
Yeah, so the dates vary based on whether or not you're excluded or specified, and whether or not you're running for, or whether or not you're tranche A or tranche B. So if you're excluded, you can't run for triads anymore after the start of the program in January 2019. And if you're specified in tranche B, you can run for triads to your heart's content. Tranche A, you can definitely continue running while you're continuing to run through your existing CM participation, but you might want to consider, if possible, becoming excluded after the end of that period, and thus no longer running for triad. It depends. We'll have to check in then to see once we actually have some clarification from DEFRA on that issue.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Saskia. I hope that answers the question. I think Lisa's maybe got a question as well.
Yes, we've had a few other questions through regarding the NOx limit. So the NOx limit outlined in the legislation as being 190 milligrams per nominal meter cube. Does this mean that the NOx limit has to be less than or equal to 190 or less than 190?
Well, it is a limit, so it is less than or equal to, but equally, if you're right on the limit, you might not pass a test, like an actual test. So you probably want to stay below.
Perfect. So we've had another question regarding measuring the output on diesel gensets, and whether that measurement has to be undertaken by a registered or traceable contractor.
Yeah, this is something that the EA guidance, so the Environment Agency's guidance, isn't particularly clear on yet, but we're hoping that they clear that up soon, and once we find something, we'll be sure to get in contact with our energy partners about it.
And then another question regarding thermal input of each generator being added together if they're on the same site for the same purpose. does that also include run hours being added together for each generator, or are these averaged across the site?
So any hour where the generators are running concurrently will count as 1 hour, but if only one generator is running, then that also counts as an hour. So if one generator runs for 1 hour, shuts down, and then another one starts and runs for the following hour, that's 2 hours. But if two generators run at the same time for an hour, that's 1 hour.
So old hands in the industry will probably remember the introduction of the Large Combustion Plant Directive, which also imposed run hour limits on units that were considered as one, and that also included the concept of units that used the same stack as being one unit. So what you had there was power stations where they had individual boilers sending their flue gases into the same stack, and as a result of that, if you ran any of the boilers and any of the turbines, you were using up the run hours for the entire site, or indeed for the half of the site if it was if they had a pair of stacks. The result of that in the LCPD, Large Combustion Plant Directive, was some very bizarre running regimes, very much an all or nothing approach to the electricity market, you know, the impact of that was significant. Here, it's not going to be particularly significant on the industry per se, because the individual elements are smaller. They're not large; they're medium. So they've carried on with that approach.
Do you have any more questions? I think Lisa's maybe got another one, do you?
Yes, so there was one just regarding sites with limited import capacity, and if they take load off the grid, and then that generator is also used to power the site for backup purposes, is this still classed as a backup generator?
I would say that if you're running less than 50 hours, you could probably get away with that. There is a special opt-out for sites that have unreliable or no connection to the grid, but you'd have to make a good case to the EA, and I'm not sure if they'd accept that. That's a specific question we'd have to take away.
Yeah, but beyond that, I think I'm right to say that the question of whether or not the electricity is entirely consumed on site, partially consumed on site, or entirely exported is not the matter that defines whether or not something is a backup generator in terms of the statutory instrument. That is about whether or not the generator is there for the purposes of emergencies, and it is used only for those emergencies and testing.
And then we also have another question regarding sites greater than 5 megawatt thermal. Does the October 2019 deadline apply if you're just doing triad avoidance?
If you're running less than 50 hours, no. If you're running more than 50 hours, yes.
And then a question specifically about DRUPS units that are used for frequency control. Are these classed as tranche A, tranche B, or an excluded generator?
For frequency control, if you're not offering the service to National Grid and you're running less than 50 hours a year, you're excluded, probably. And if you have a contract with National Grid through an aggregator or through yourselves, then that's classed as a balancing service. So if it's a contract that was signed before Halloween last year, then it's tranche A, and if it's a new contract, then you're a tranche B generator. So you'll need to comply by January 2019.
Yeah, I think that the distinction there is that DRUPS units have a particular role in managing power quality on a site, and will from time to time take a site off the mains in the instance that there is a variation in voltage or a variation in mains frequency that is not the same as a blackout or an actual power cut. And to be quite honest, I don't think that has really been considered in the legislation. So that's probably an open matter, and we will take that forward with our other inquiries. And then just another question about run hours. When does the count for run hours start? Is it from the date of the legislation, so the 29th of January, or is it from the deadline outlined in the webinar?
So run hours are counted per calendar year. So if you're counting your run hours for 2019, then it's the calendar year 2019. They might look at your run hours from the last 3 or 5 years if you're an MCP, but they'll look at the average run hours per calendar year.
And then a question regarding permitting with the relevant environment agency. Do Flexitricity have any visibility on what timelines they are working to and what's required as part of the permitting process?
Not really. It's still all in draft form from the EA's point of view, from the Environment Agency in England. But once we get more clarity, we'll definitely be speaking to energy partners about it.
Okay, great. I don't believe we have any other questions. I'll just double check. One thing, I think there is a question about will the slides and recording be available after the webinar? Yes, they will. We'll be sending that out. And then there is actually one more question that's come in. What happens if the contract to operate in balancing service markets is held by a third party, e.g. aggregator, rather than the operator? Does this mean you can't transfer between aggregators without losing your tranche status?
So because the aggregator is the person with the contract, we think technically you should be able to switch between aggregators because the definitions are about the generator being used to fulfill a contract, not who has the contract. So I think the legislation is relatively who holds the contract agnostic. Newness is the date of the agreement, not the date when the generator agreed to the agreement.
There is also one further question on triads. So the question concerns the disappearance of triads and the effect of this on how people will operate in response to the NCP related legislation. I suppose the first thing is triads not disappearing yet. There is a phase out on triad value in respect of electricity export from a site. At present, there is full triad value available to anybody who uses a generator of any kind to cover on-site consumption. So that presently is not subject to any diminution. So that's not the changes that Ofgem are making to the charging regime as we see it just now will not particularly change the interpretation that the agencies place on this legislation. Having said that, I think I said it during the talk that the interpretation, the guidance that we've had from DEFRA on this point doesn't really correspond to specific clauses within the legislation. So they're saying that they'll interpret things in a certain way, but we don't see that the legislation specifically requires that to be the case. So that one is still very open. From our point of view, we're not really expecting anybody to be wanting to deviate from the guidance until there are more definite results, potentially even arising from court, which ultimately will arbitrate these things. We don't believe that anybody doing triad management or balancing services should do so in such a way as to render them vulnerable to court action. I think that's not our battle. There are a few more questions that have come in. How do the rules apply to potential future services for a DSO rather than national grid?
So the definition of a balancing service in the England and Wales statutory instrument is a balancing service sold to the TSO. So only national grid services actually count as balancing services in the way that the legislation is written. So you could theoretically put DSO services outside of that, but it's probably going to be similar to triads in that it might lead you to no longer be counted as running for the sole purpose of keeping the site on if you lose mains.
Okay, another question here. What if you have two generators, but the site load is always lower than the capacity of one generator? Do we still sum the two capacities up, as we would never run two at the same time? The second one is just there for redundancy.
This is going to be based on the way that for the same purpose is interpreted. I mean, like I said, it's unclear, but I think you could probably say that those are for the same purpose. It just happens that one of them isn't used as much as the other.
So well, I think this is a great question because it does identify an area where the complexities of site operation haven't been fully thought through in preparing the legislation. So the question is an N+1 generator. My expectation is that the DEFRA and the agencies will take a fairly obvious interpretation, which is that the generator, the +1 generator, is there, and therefore it's counted. So you've got two in a row, and the control system only ever starts one, and the other is a spare. I would expect that they would be counted together, but it doesn't say that because that case hasn't really been considered.
Okay, we've got two more questions. SCR NOx control, is it required to be used for all run hours or only during CM events or response to balancing services calls?
All run hours. As part of the legislation, you're going to have to keep a record to show that the SCR control is on at all times. It's part of the monitoring and compliance that the EA or whichever authority will be doing during the lifetime of this legislation.
So you're going to have to keep your AdBlue tank topped up.
And then a question relating to, I believe this will be part of the permitting process. Is there a rated thermal input on generator data sheets, or do we need to use the nominal electrical efficiency to obtain it from the nominal electrical rating?
Yeah, I think it's likely to be the latter. I'm not a generator manufacturer, so I don't know what's on all data sheets, but I think generally taking your efficiency and your rated capacity is probably the easiest way to work out your thermal efficiency, your thermal input.
Okay, I think that is all the questions that we've had. Thanks again, everyone, for attending this morning. As I mentioned before, this webinar has been recorded, and we will be sending out the recording and the slides in due course. If you do have any further questions, feel free to contact us, either info@flexitricity.com, or if you have Lisa or I's email addresses, feel free to email us directly. Thanks again, everyone, for participating. Hope you've not been too adversely affected by the weather this morning, and we'll speak to you all again soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.